The scent of dried hay and old leather hung heavy in the air inside Blackwood Auction House, mingling with the warm, dusty perfume that rises from packed earth and animals. Hooves tapped a steady rhythm on the dirt floor as men moved between stalls, voices low and practiced, laughter spilling out in sudden bursts that sounded almost rehearsed. Well-dressed buyers in tailored coats and polished shoes drifted through the stables like predators on a hunt, their eyes trained to pick out flaw from favor in a single measured glance. For them, the auction was a ritual as much as a business transaction, a place to display wealth, test influence, and win prestige by turning a simple purchase into a public statement. In the middle of that polished theater, a single older man cut a different shape against the light. His skin was weathered, his face mapped by decades in sun and wind, his clothes plain and worn. A faded shirt, a threadbare vest, boots that had seen more seasons than most people in the room. He was not the kind of figure who usually drew notice in a hall of opulence and soft laughter, and yet the attention that circled him was not directed at his clothing or his age. It was aimed at the magnificent white stallion at his side. The horse called Silver Dust was impossible to ignore. His coat caught and held the warm lamp light, sending back a soft glow like a living sculpture carved from bone and silk. Muscles moved under that coat with the quiet confidence of something bred to move fast and last long. Steps precise, shoulders broad, the head carried with the calm of old bloodlines. His eyes were intelligent and aware, scanning the room with a patience that suggested he understood this place better than most of the men who owned it. Purebred Arabian, straight from a line that inspired reverence. To a crowd of breeders and investors, he was pedigree made visible, a potential trophy, a future champion. To the older man leading him, he was everything left after a lifetime of loss, a tether to a home that had unraveled. At 72 years old, the man had been pushed to the edge of survival. Years of drought had thinned the land until it no longer fed a family. Unpaid debts had wrapped around the heart of his ranch like a vice, and creditors had swallowed what remained. The world that had once been familiar shut its gates and walked on, leaving him with fewer places to turn. Yet there had always been Silver Dust, the steady white presence that had endured storms and nights of worry, a single constant that had kept memory and dignity intact. With options gone, the man had come to sell the last thing he could not afford to keep, or at least that was what everyone in that bright, organized room assumed. He led Silver Dust into the appraisal area and watched as heads turned. Whispers broke out like wind through dry grass. Some men chuckled, others raised bemused eyebrows. A young man in a beige suit murmured to an older companion, smirking. Probably a stable hand who wandered in by mistake, came the quiet reply, half jest, half dismissal. The old man paid the comments little mind and stepped forward with the calm of someone who had weathered worse than ridicule. The auctioneer peered over thin spectacles, notes in hand, his moustache pinched in a way that suggested impatience. He asked, as if confirming a detail he intended to fold into a ledger and discard. The older man answered simply and steadily. What he lacked in showmanship, he made up for in firmness. Silver Dust's heritage was flawless, the man said, explaining he had raised and trained the stallion himself, and in anything he spoke of he sounded more like a man presenting a truth than making a plea. The room's reaction was immediate and sharp. A voice oozed across the floor like oil spilling over grain. Charles Davenport, a powerful breeder in an expensive black suit, let out a laugh that ate civility. Contempt threaded his words as he scoffed that the animal might be impressive but came from a bankrupt ranch, and what proof was there it was worth more than a joke? A ripple of humor and derision moved through the buyers. Some folded their arms, some smirked openly. The auctioneer cleared his throat, ready to move on. "We'll start the bidding at 11,000, he announced, folding the old man's offering into the night's expected theater. Silence fell. Hands remained down, no one moved. Then someone from the back shouted out a mocking $10 and laughter exploded like a struck match. The old man's jaw tightened, the reins dug into his fingers, and his heart beat not with fury but with a quiet, immovable conviction. They could laugh, he thought, they could not see what he saw. They could not see the bloodline asleep in those bones, the years of training and trust that steadied the stallion. When he lifted his head and spoke, his voice carried that same steady certainty. None of them, he said, had any idea what they were about to lose, and when they found out, they would regret it. The laughter that had rolled through the stables faded into an awkward hush. Faces turned from merriment to puzzled curiosity. The sneers dimmed into squints. The old man's words had opened a door they had not expected. Then he revealed what he had kept folded tight for years, the secret he had not given away for fear of greed and for fear of being dismissed as a liar. Silver Dust, the man said, was not an ordinary horse from a failing ranch. He was a direct descendant of Stormborn, the legendary champion whose name had become more of a myth than a reality among breeders. Stormborn's undefeated record had been whispered about in barns for decades, his endurance the stuff of folklore, and his bloodline had been considered extinct. Charles Davenport's mirth cracked into a scowl. "That's impossible," he declared, though doubt laced his voice. Others exchanged quick breaths and glances. The auctioneer accepted the old man's outstretched, yellowed paper with a careful hand, the pedigree certificate folded and worn in the way only documents that had been trusted for long years become. He scanned it, color left his face. The room that had been ready to humiliate a man fell into a current of stunned speculation. If that document was genuine, Silver Dust was not merely valuable, he was priceless. The men who had mocked the old man now leaned forward with a hunger that erased their earlier disdain. Pride turned to regret on several faces. Davenport, who had been so bold in scorn, tightened his jaw, unwilling to admit he had been wrong but plainly shaken by the possibility. Henry, who had spent a lifetime dismissed and looked past, could finally feel something like vindication wash over him. He did not gloat. He simply let the silence hold its weight, then asked for the bidding to begin anew. The mood of the auction shifted like weather. Opened eyes narrowed into calculation. The auctioneer, now an instrument of sharp professionalism rather than casual entertainment, announced a new starting bid at $50,000. Gasps threaded the air. The same men who had offered a cruel $10 now found themselves confronting a number 5,000 times greater. First hands rose with certainty, then others followed. The numbers climbed at a dizzying pace. 50, 60, 75, 80, 90, 100,000. Voices rose with desperation, swallowing prior mockery beneath a new hunger. Henry watched while the men who had once derided him shredded one another with offers. In his chest was a complex tide of feeling. Part of him wanted to let their greed become their ruin, to watch as their need humbled them. But cruelty was not the aim. This had never been merely about revenge. It was about proving that worth remained when virtue and need had been stripped away. Bids soared past 200,000 and the room's frenzy reached a peak. Two men remained in the ring. Charles Davenport and Walter Harrington, a breeder known for spending whatever it took to get what he wanted. For a breathless moment time seemed to stall. Davenport hesitated, then conceded the limit of his appetite and folded. Harrington, composed and cool, lifted his hand one final time, 350,000, and the room burst into noise. Astonishment, greed turned to triumph. The sudden validation of value trashed moments before. The gavel struck. Silver Dust had become the highest-priced horse of the night. Hunger in the eyes of the buyers turned into the kind of astonished respect that comes from having a preconception overturned. Harrington rose from his seat and approached the old man with a smooth, professional air. He offered handshakes and words that mixed business with a grudging admiration, complimenting the man who had understood a horse's true worth. For a blink, the old man looked down at the money that could replace what had been lost, at a sum that would erase debt and rebuild trust. But what filled him then was not debt alone. Silver dust had been a companion through drought and sorrow, a shelter in a life stripped to its bones. To let him go felt like giving up a last home. The auction hall held its breath when the old man spoke. He turned to the auctioneer and said with clarity and finality that silver dust was no longer for sale. Shock rippled, faces flushed with confusion and something bordering on anger. Harrington's smile soured into a hard line. Davenport and the others whispered among themselves, stunned that anyone could refuse such a fortune. Yet the old man's decision was not born from showmanship. He reminded them all implicitly that money passes through hands and houses and seasons. Silver dust, he said, was not a commodity to be bought and displayed. He was a once-in-a-lifetime bond. With that, the old man led the horse out into the cool night air, and for the first time in many years he felt something he had thought the world had taken. Dignity. The exit was not triumphant in the way a win at auction might have been. It was quieter and steadier, the measured step of someone who had claimed a small but vital truth. Those who had gathered inside watched in stunned silence, their calculations interrupted by a reminder that some things are beyond price. Outside, the air drew a thin line of chill, and as the duo moved away from the light and the buzz of commerce, silver dust exhaled in a long, steady sound that seemed to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The older man murmured to the stallion in a voice that belonged to a quiet conversation between close friends, words that spoke of still being together and not being done yet. Footsteps approached. Charles Davenport emerged from the dark with hands in his coat pockets. His manner softened into something that welcomed correction. He admitted he had been wrong in his earlier judgment and offered a proposition that carried more than money. A place at his breeding farm, respect for the horse's future, and an opening that preserved the old man's control over silver dust. The offer came not as charity, but as a recognition of worth, an invitation to rebuild where dignity could be protected. It was, in a sense, a second chance. For a man hardened by loss, the idea of trusting a man who had once laughed was not easy to accept. Yet this was not merely about trusting Davenport. It was an opportunity to step back into a world that had once shut its doors and to shape a future on terms that felt true. After a long moment of thought, the old man accepted, but on his own terms. Full control over silver dust's training, no meddling with methods or bonds, and no contracts that would turn the horse into a mere asset. Davenport, perhaps intrigued by the stubborn integrity that matched his own pursuit of excellence, agreed to the conditions with the frankness of a man who respected a good challenge. The handshake that followed was not the grasp of a returned soldier. It was the exchange of two men who understood that worth was shown by action, not rhetoric. Early mornings at Davenport stables smelled of fresh-cut hay, of citrus from the polish on equipment, and of the steam that rose from horses awakening to the day. The estate sprawled in precise order, a contrast to the old man's rutted memories of a ranch that had once been wild in its own way. Silver dust moved in that new world with the same steady dignity as before, his movements a reminder that lineage can carry itself into unfamiliar places and still remain itself. Training began in a rhythm that honored patience over force. The stable hands watched as the white stallion responded to the lightest of cues, his body a map of well-timed strength and economy of motion. The old man's methods were less about strict command than a conversation built over years. He had always relied on trust, understanding that a horse that surrenders to fear will never become fast in the way that matters in a race. He coaxed rather than commanded, praised rather than punished, and in the paddocks and the quiet lanes silver dust began to show the fine-tuned speed in which the bloodline had been said to specialize. Word spread slowly at first through the neat rows of stables, then faster as guests and whispering visitors compared notes. Rumors grew into excitement, and curiosity turned into a plan. Davenport proposed entry into a private, high-stakes race, where results could transform a horse from a rumor into an immortal name. The race would attract the elite of the breeding and racing world, money and reputation stacked on each finish line. The old man did not seek fame. He had not trained Silver Dust for trophies, but deep down a quiet ember of hope kindled. If Silver Dust could prove himself in the arena, perhaps the old man's life could be measured anew. Training intensified with single-minded focus. Each day the stallion ran longer, sharper, learning how to channel his natural grace into the kind of controlled burst that wins races by inches. The old man watched every stride, feeling an old pulse of certainty return. There was a rhythm he had always known, a way to coax muscle, breath, and will into a single, unstoppable motion. Stable hands who had once looked on with skepticism now watched with steady admiration as the pair moved across training grounds. Davenport kept measuring in the corners of his mind, trading reserve for respect as the horse's talent translated into consistent results at practice. The night before the race, the stable was still apart from the louder business of money and bets. The old man stood in Silver Dust's stall and ran a hand along the horse's flank, whispering a steadying cadence that had seldom been needed but always trusted. They were not showing the world anything it had demanded. They were reminding themselves who they were. Race day dawned with the impatient hum of engines, the murmur of crowds, and the electric tension of money and expectation. Silver Dust stood calm at the starting gate, coat glossy under the sun, breath measured, as if the race itself were only the natural expression of the power he had always carried. The other horses were finely tuned, trained for precision, matched with jockeys who could squeeze the last advantage from muscle and habit. Yet as the gates flew open, Silver Dust exploded forward with a freedom that was not raw speed alone, but a smooth, effortless acceleration shaped by trust and experience. He ran like memory made flesh, each stride a statement that lineage and bond cannot be manufactured. The pack surged, dust and adrenaline mixing in the heat of competition. By the halfway point, Silver Dust had closed on the leaders, moving through the field with a grace that stopped whispers into outright gasps. Spectators strained to see the unknown white horse that had burst from the background into contention. Davenport watched from the stands with a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with seeing raw potential come to given form. As the final stretch approached, the front runners pushed hard, hooves beating a thunder that felt designed to intimidate. Silver Dust did not falter. Instead, he found a gear that seemed to exist just beyond the reach of astonished bettors and seasoned trainers, surging ahead in a final desperate convergence. The nose that won the race was thin as a breath. When they crossed the line, the crowd exploded into noise and stunned silence in the same instant. The men who had once laughed now stood in bewilderment, some with hands over mouths, others looking at one another as if newly introduced to their own fallibility. The old man dismounted when the race had settled and stood with that steady, unpretentious air of a person who knows what a win truly means. Silver Dust snorted a low, triumphant sound and tossed his head, not in vanity, but in the relief that comes after hard work paid off. They had not only won a race, they had rewritten a story. The narrative that had been trying to define the old man as a relic and the horse as a commodity had been undone by the pair's quiet conviction. Davenport approached with an expression softened by genuine admiration, the kind of look people reserve for the rare moment when talent meets integrity. He admitted he had been wrong and acknowledged that the old man's steadfast refusal to sell, his insistence on what truly mattered, had proven far more valuable than the money on a ledger. The old man's smile was small but real. He had walked into an auction believing he had nothing left, but he now stood beside the greatest horse he had ever raised and felt the truth he had always known. Nothing had been lost that could not be returned. The story did not end at the finish line. The victory opened doors that were practical and humane. Offers arrived not as attempts to exploit but as invitations to stabilize and build. The old man considered each one with the same care he had shown his horse, measured, wary, but not closed off. Trust was no longer a finite resource he refused to risk. It was a thing to be earned and held with clear boundaries. The days that followed were full of quieter victories. Silver dust settled into a routine that balanced rest and the excitement of newfound recognition. The old man's hands grew calloused again in a different way, not from repair and loss, but from steady work and careful improvement. People who had mocked his plain clothes and older face began to come by with new manners, tempered by the clear evidence of what patience and honesty can accomplish. There was no rush to rebuild everything at once. Instead, there was a slow reclaiming of purpose. The lessons of the months that followed were simple and stubborn. Worth is not only a number on a bill of sale. Respect must be demonstrated through deeds, not assumed, and dignity can be found even when the world seems intent on stripping it away. For those who saw the white stallion race past the finish line, and for those who watched the old man refuse a fortune to preserve what mattered most, the lesson landed with the weight of truth. Together they had upended a room of men who mistook money for meaning and had replaced conjecture with proof. The life that began to open was neither a fairy tale nor a tidy restoration. It was work, slow and honest. Yet each morning, the white horse and the older man moved through the paddocks with the easy, companionable rhythm of two beings who had chosen each other when the rest of the world had chosen a ledger. The future remained uncertain, but uncertainty was no longer a prison. It was a wide field waiting to be walked. In the quiet that followed the race, the old man often found himself watching silver dust move through the morning mist, feeling a calm that had not been his for years. He had once thought his story had ended at the auction block. Instead, it had reached a new chapter that mixed humility and stubborn pride, failures and triumphs folded into a life still being lived. The stallion's steady steps were a reminder that being forced to prove worth does not strip a person of dignity. Sometimes it draws that dignity out and sets it in relief against the world. For listeners drawn to this tale, let it be remembered as a story about value that cannot be counted in currency, about the quiet strength that comes from refusing bargains that cheapen what matters, and about the way patience, trust, and a refusal to be defined by loss can write a new ending. If this story landed with some part of the heart, consider keeping similar stories alive. Subscribe to follow more narratives that celebrate grit and quiet honor, like to signal appreciation when a tale resonates, and share to pass along the reminder that some things are simply beyond price.